Hello and welcome to Small Group Presentation 2 on Cultural Analysis by Alina, James, that's me, Jonathan, Riley, and Ryan. Our presentation is a cultural analysis of the 2025 Ryan Coogler horror film Sinners. Before we get into the summary and analysis, I'm going to present our first section, Cultural Analysis Explained. Chapter 6 in our text, Cultural Analysis, opens with a vivid description of the cultural impact Donald Glover's 2018 music video for This Is America had on the world. Those of you who have seen it know the video is quite jarring, and its message received both positive and negative attention when it came out. Some people were concerned that the disturbing video, particularly his portrayal of gun violence, could influence people to mirror those actions. Others felt that the video brought much-needed attention to the issues surrounding gun violence, while still others were outraged that the video was a direct attack on the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Ultimately, scholars of cultural studies were intrigued by the varied positions on Donald Glover's media text and how it might change perceptions on these issues, both politically and socially, in the mass population. There are many other songs and music videos that have created cultural division and provided something to consider on both sides of an issue. I'm a fan of the Irish singer-songwriter Hozier, and he has made provocative pieces of music that have caused public attention to shift to prominent issues. His 2013 hit Take Me to Church and his ballad Cherry Wine shed critical light on violence. Both songs deliver messages that shouldn't be challenged, and how songs and videos like these bring attention to these issues are of great interest to those engaged in cultural studies. Cultural analysis examines how social constructs like class, race, gender, and many others affect public perception and the study of all the different views on these subjects. The cultural impact This Is America had on the public was a perfect example of how a media text can cause dissent and how the study of all schools of thought on these issues it brought attention to is important. A cultural analysis of the current political climate, including media texts circulating on television and the internet, is not something I want to engage in for the purposes of this presentation, but it's certainly an interesting concept to consider. On that note, finally, cultural analysis interprets how great power and privilege can influence mass perceptions locally and globally. While I was looking for a great academic source to include with my presentation, I stumbled across a fantastic 1953 paper for the Foreign Service Institute, Department of State, by Edward T. Hall Jr. and George L. Traeger called The Analysis of Culture. The paper casts a wide net over cultural studies, as the authors diligently work to create a structure that adequately supports the vastness of what they consider to be a new science. Several sections of the paper are interesting, certainly amusing, such as the following passage about the cultural realities of marriage. Page 31 of the 1953 paper reads, "The informal aspects of marriage have to do largely with space and with time. Courtship was indicated above in the expression to get a mate. Both space and time play a prominent role in courtship, and there are places and times for courting. It's in these areas that the young can do little to alter things. In many cases, they simply have to wait for it to get dark, or for the Christmas season, or for springtime to arrive." Their conclusion is a dry 1950s take on new ideas of the concepts of cultural analysis. It reads, "The present article is a theoretical paper setting forth a hypothesis and methodology for the analysis of culture as a whole and specific cultural systems. It is based on observation of the behavior of man as a mammal and as a member of society and a participant in culture." It's very dry and a very old way of thinking about cultural studies. Modern-day cultural studies benefits from over 70 years of research since the 1953 paper. The definition of culture and ideology has evolved, so what exactly is culture in 2025? Sociologist Michael Richardson says, "Culture is simply what human beings produce and the means by which we preserve what we have produced. According to the textbook, culture is comprised of three forms: physical, social, and attitudinal. Physical forms of culture are simply the things we leave behind as a culture that can be studied. These things are referred to as artifacts and help identify the behaviors of a culture. Any man-made object can be an artifact, including the phones we use, or the cars we drive, vinyl records, even clothing. Social forms of culture involve the study of how we, as a culture, might have used the artifacts to understand our shared experiences, how our society operates. Attitudinal forms of culture are basically the attitudes our society has regarding morality and ethics, basically how we feel about the world around us. So here you see a few examples of physical forms of culture or artifacts in centers. We see Sammy's guitar before it was shattered, a stake being formed for destroying a vampire, and the mojo bag Annie gave to Smoke. How would these items be studied to learn about the behaviors of the society they came from? All three items are great sources of power. The guitar is particularly important in the film, as Sammy uses his music to bridge the ancestral past and the future. And even though his preacher father orders him to drop it at the end of the movie, he can't. He won't. As an artifact, a physical form of culture in centers, the guitar gives a student of cultural studies a lot to consider. There are many physical forms of culture in the movie. These are just a few. These artifacts can be studied along with social and attitudinal forms of culture to learn about behaviors of the community in centers. Basically, culture is collective, rhetorical, historical, and ideological. Collective because it is shared within a group, no matter how large or small. Rhetorical because it requires communication with others and it has an agreed upon meaning within the group. Historical in that it changes and evolves over time. And ideological, which means a culture is unconsciously expected to feel a certain way about a familiar subject. Ideology channels the way human beings feel about culture. Before we move further into our presentation, we need to understand ideology. A fascinating and informative example of ideology is found in Chapter 6 on page 147 of our text. French scholar Michel Foucault's study of madness in Renaissance Europe is enlightening, as mental instability was not perceived as unacceptable in society until the 17th century. Those citizens who were considered mad began being imprisoned in sanitariums at that time, and the main reason was that they didn't contribute financially to society. In that instance, culture was informed by the way society was trained to feel about madness, and the shift in thinking is a notable example of ideology. We're all products of a network of ideologies that we've unconsciously absorbed through our experiences. Ideology limits our ideas, illuminating some and hiding others. The text refers to the way the Republican and Democratic parties, by their outward nature, serve each other and that they help their members determine right from wrong, good ideas versus bad ideas in their estimation. Ideology also normalizes behavior we find to be unquestionable, behavior we engage in that is clearly imbalanced due to power and dominance. Privilege is another characteristic of ideology, and society accepts that powerful groups of people are more privileged than the groups that are dominated by them. The fourth function of ideology is interpolation, which is how we allow cultural ideology to identify us. The function of interpolation assumes that we're already indoctrinated by existing ideologies, and we step into this identity willingly, whether consciously or unconsciously. We've explained the concepts of cultural studies and cultural analysis and how important ideologies are to understanding them. Now comes the more interesting part, learning how cultural scholars apply these concepts and give us a deeper understanding of media texts. We are excited to present the cultural analysis of Ryan Coogler's 2025 horror film, Sinners. Thank you for your time.
Summary of Sinners. It was October 16, 1932, in Clarksville, Mississippi. The film follows a young boy named Samuel, or Sammy, to his friends and family. Sammy goes on a little trip with his twin cousins, Smoke and Stack. But the trip of recruiting people to join in their little juke comes to a terrifying turn when evil arises to get them. As night falls, Sammy, along with his cousin Smoke and a few other friends, have to defend themselves from vampires who are wanting him for his music, in order to summon more vampires into the real world. Though as time goes on, fear overtakes them, making them weary on who could be trusted and having to form a plan on how to kill them.
What is the ideological process? The ideological process can be described in 3 different categories or sections, with the first category being myth. A myth is a sacred story or message that gives about a certain ideology when people think about it. This thinking can be brought about by people, cultures, religions, time periods, and more. The movie Sinners by Ryan Coogler deals with the centuries-old myth of vampires, who are the main antagonists of this film. Stories and myths of vampires have been around as long as the Mesopotamians and Hebrew times, but gained more notice in the 19th century due to Gothic literature brought about by authors John Polidori and Bram Stoker, respectively The Vampire in 1819 and Dracula in 1897. Why is this myth important, though? These 2 people helped shape the image of what a vampire is and gave us the ideology for future thinking of said myth. The same weaknesses that Polidori and Stoker used in their renditions years ago are still carried on with the myth today. The second use of myth revolves around the idea of someone being able to play music so true that it can let them play music with the past and future selves. This myth was known all over the world, with its name being changed to match the culture it was currently in. In ancient Ireland, they were called Fili. In Choctaw land, their names were Firekeepers. And in West Africa, they were referred to as griots. It was known as a gift that could heal communities, but also bring forward evil spirits. It is this myth that makes the vampires believe that if they were able to turn Sammy, they would be able to use his talent to communicate with their own past loved ones as a collective. The vampires worked as a hive mind in the sense that if the head vampire turned a person, he gained not only their memories, but also their ability as well. The next category, doxa, describes the common sense or norm among a culture. Doxa is not looked at as strange, but instead is found as normal thing to do or say among the community. During the slavery period, it was normal among the Southern community to randomly go out at the end of a week after working in the fields and go to a juke joint, a party where one is meant to get disorderly or rowdy. From there, it would be dancing, drinking, and singing music until one had their fill. These type of parties were to help the Southern communities forget about their situation that they were currently in, even if it was for only one night at a time. Trying to start new with the money that was stolen from Chicago, Smoke and Stack buy land and property to create their own juke joint in hopes of making money and providing a break for people. Our third category, hegemony, is the culture or economic dominance over a particular group. This dominance can be done either by force or the one consent of the governed. Although the idea may be accepted by the community as a whole, does not mean that it is accepted by all, especially those who were dominated. The vampires in the movie Sinners take up after white Southern civilization, in which they are the white man trying to take black Southern culture for their own. As stated earlier, the main reason that the vampires came over to the juke joint in the first place was because they wanted Sammy's soulful music to help communicate with the dead. Not wanting to give up his cousin, though, Smoke says time and time again that he will not give him up. After being denied entry, periodically throughout the film, the vampires would sing English songs to psychologically break the survivors holed up in the warehouse. On the surface, this might not seem like a lot, but it is just another way to show how the vampires or white civilization will assimilate anything that they might like for their own. The beginning of the movie talks about how they were known across many different civilizations, and as the movie progresses, it shows all those different cultures that were taken in. In the end, the vampires were able to sing the English songs, dance the Irish jig, and speak in perfect Chinese. This only after taking in each person or culture into the hive mind.
In the 2025 film Sinners by Ryan Coogler, the ideology and media representation of class is shown as an intertwined idea concerning the history of the Jim Crow era in Mississippi, the persistent oppressive racial history connected, and the exploitation of cultural identity and the people apart, respectively. The film uses the allegory of vampirism and horror to indirectly show and tell viewers of how capitalism and racism can consume a person's cultural identity, exploiting not just labor, but art as well. For background, as per Dr. David Pilgrim, the Jim Crow era refers to the racial caste system, which operated primarily but not exclusively in southern and border states between 1877 and the mid-1960s. Jim Crow era was more than a series of rigid anti-black laws. Under Jim Crow, African Americans were relegated to the status of second-class citizens. Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-black racism. Due to previous laws subjugating black Americans, many still face intentional marginalization and oppression today. This includes people a part of different cultures, as well as, mentioned in our textbook, individuals other than the supposed non-race of white people were targeted, with perpetrators claiming varying violent excuses. Like previously mentioned, the capitalistic overpower/consumption and simultaneous cultural appropriation of varying individuals is represented as vampirism, wherein the at the time other victims of dominant cultures in the movie An Irish Vampire are pining to consume the profit arising from people a part of black culture who are making their own way, feeding on stolen resources like music and other creative forms, otherwise known as art. An example is the dynamic made clear in the film where Sammy, who is one of the main characters, is a part of a blues band the twin brothers have assembled to hopefully create a safe shared space for the town's oppressed community to come together and be rid of constructs like class and race. The building they're in, formerly a sawmill, also represents a new business that the brothers have come back home to start and grow. The capital or profit that the vampire Remick glimpsed and nearly immediately wanted for himself. The blues music played by Sammy is his, the bandmates, and the gathered individuals' shared art form. Listening and dancing to the music allows them to let go of themselves and be free. The art form functions as an outlet connecting each person to their shared history and simultaneous historical trauma. In the moment, it's like they're all transcending space-time spiritually, especially with the spirits joining the dance. American Dream. In United States media, often there is this common ideology shared referred to as the American dream, wherein if individuals work hard enough and have the drive to pursue any goal, then they will eventually come by success, equating happiness. This stereotype embodies the complex of fixed ideas about the world that determine a way of life and interpretation of experience. Thus, it functions as the gauge of human achievements in American culture. The notion that highly determined hard work will eventually ensue comfortable, sustainable success sets a false belief in many, because it fails to recognize the injustices people come across daily that have nothing to do with work ethic and everything to do with social constructs, stereotypes, and full-on blocks that hold citizens from advancing in life. As Ott and Matt state, it symbolically erases real issues of social inequality, class struggle, profit motive, and so on that may function as barriers towards success. Rather, adhering to the American dream can gradually make one complicit and, in turn, an active participant in the exploitation of labor and resources from growing individuals, families, geographical areas, etc. Token. A part of the social construction of the American dream is the idea of a token, meaning an individual, group, or whoever that has become the embodied fulfillment of the ideology, moving themselves up in socioeconomic status through personal ambition and capability. A token is technically an exception to widely known social rules, and when someone arises having made their own way, they become a sort of renowned affirmation of the ideology posited. Furthermore, contemporary examples of the dream garner impressive amounts of media recognition, displaying their success as just one of many who earned it via persistent labor and grit. This representation dismisses the unseen forces acting as barriers, holding back humanity through systemic marginalization and consistent oppression. Early in the movie, the main characters Smoke and Stack have come back home. We're given background knowledge that leads us to believe the twins have just finished working for Al Capone, the very successful and infamous late businessman. They arrive with a hefty amount of money they plan to do something beneficial for their community with. This large vast of wealth they earned places them as up-and-coming entrepreneurs and on the other side of wealth disparity, something unknown for many marginalized individuals throughout the South in the 1930s. The brothers have attained the American dream, gaining success and token recognition by their own hard work. Upon seeing this, the vampire from before, Remick, aims to siphon off this newfound profit and turns a racist couple into vampires as well, who I think were depicted as KKK members to aid in his scheme. As the film progresses, the turning of individuals into vampires is made to represent the assimilation and near erasure of cultural identity into the dominant culture, shown through exploitative means like capitalism, cultural appropriation, and so on. Sinners depicts the contrast in the brothers' similar but ultimately different paths. Both brothers are wealthy. They earned and remade their own. How and what each chose to do in the movie to achieve success can be separate portrayals, one falling under and giving in to vampirism, or as it signified, the idea of capitalism and coming to perpetuate the same exploitative cycle the marginalized vampire does unto most everyone, and what white culture did in the Jim Crow era, respectively. Still today, ideologies like the American dream instill false hope in an unjust system. Furthermore, there are different forms of freedom from systemic oppression showcased, first by Sammy and Smoke, each choosing to independently make their own ways, relying on their own capabilities and determination, and secondly, through another character, Annie's knowledge of hoodoo, a cultural spirituality and ancestral tradition. She seeks solace and community, and in the same regard fiercely protects the ones she cares for. In all, Annie's portrayal of resilience seemed to garner more power in alleviating herself from systemic oppression in comparison to the twins' goal of attaining and regenerating capital. Conspicuous consumption. Another and just as important ideology, known as conspicuous consumption, can be understood as a belief in the ability to gain success to specific benefits like experiences, institutions, and status one would otherwise have not been granted before having purchased material goods and services similar to the upper class. The ideology of conspicuous consumption uses the power of social identity to persuade individuals into believing that buying specific products will provide social and economic mobility, concealing the true intentions behind where these ideas originated, not allowing individuals to see that the same institutions and experience they want access to are a player in the perpetuation of class divides and inequity. Throughout Sinners, I didn't see much representation of conspicuous consumption. In the story, however, there were some quieter forms of wealth denoted by the twins after having come back from making money. For example, purchasing the sawmill from Hogwood to establish a juke joint must have required a considerable amount of money. Summary. The 2025 film Sinners portrays/represents class and ideology associated with class as a complex and persistent issue tied to power dynamics, wherein the broader historical injustices of economic exploitation and systemic oppression are made apparent using the mythology of vampires. In the end, the message is that truly meaningful and sustained freedom is found through both preserving cultural identity and tending to/finding strength in one's community.
Hello and welcome to our section on media, ideology, and representation on race and ethnicity in Ryan Coogler's Sinner. We have learned the importance of ideology in cultural analysis and how it channels the way human beings feel about culture, the way ideology normalizes cultural behaviors, and how we allow it to identify us. Studies that focus on race, ethnicity, and media take into consideration how ideology has affected the way media texts are presented to society. Scholars identified the imbalance of power and privilege in media texts that favor white ideals and cultural structures over non-white ideals and cultural structures. These texts gently and not so gently expect media consumers to accept media as normal, to accept whiteness as normal, and the white cultures are the cultural standard. This imbalance of cultural messaging is beautifully illustrated in the film Sinners, as white ideologies in the fight not to conform to them saturate the fabric of the movie. There are 5 key concepts that are used to identify how ideologies overlap in American culture, and we are going to explore how each of these concepts are present or absent in Sinners. These concepts are exclusion, whitewashing, stereotyping, assimilation, and othering. Exclusion. Exclusion is the first ideological concept we will discuss, and it is self-explanatory. Exclusion is the underrepresentation of certain cultural groups in the media, which gives greater credence to the idea of white privilege and cultural dominance. The textbook illustrates exclusion in a remarkably effective way. The largest ethnic minority in the United States is the Latino population. Yet one has only to look at television and movies to see how underrepresented Latinos are in American media. There is no exclusion in Sinners, although you can make an argument for the minimal screen time the Native American group had in the movie. It was interesting how they came to warn the Klan couple about a dangerous man, instead of trusting a Native American who looked trustworthy and had a pleasant demeanor. They chose to trust a crazed white guy who showed up unexpectedly, his skin literally smoking. Whitewashing. Whitewashing is when white actors are given ethnic roles that should be played by minority actors. This is done in a couple of separate ways, and first being through wardrobe, mannerism, or speech. These characterizations are always awful, hard to watch performances that do not resonate with audiences, particularly today. One of the worst examples of whitewashing is Mikey Rooney's portrayal. One of the worst examples of whitewashing is Mikey Rooney's portrayal of the Japanese man in Black Edward's film Breakfast at Tiffany's. The second way whitewashing happens is through story adaptations from source material. White characters are incorporated into what were originally non-white roles. Whitewashing nurtures the white privilege issues and normalizes the idea that white actors are more desirable than non-white actors. There was no whitewashing in Sinners that I noticed, as Ryan Coogler was making a movie that was the exact opposite of films that allow that to happen. Stereotyping. Stereotyping is when a culture or a minority's racial group is characterized in a way that overlooks complexities and presents flawed representations. These stereotypes are not always negative, but they cast judgments about the ethnic and morality of certain groups that affected how the rest of the society perceives them. In Sinners, Ryan Coogler did a fantastic job of dodging stereotypes, as all the characters had complex, rich lives. You can tell the director had a firm hand on the material. Assimilation. Assimilation in media is when a non-white culture or minority group is assimilated into white culture by simultaneously disregarding oppressive experiences the group has experienced and feigning diversity. These instances of assimilation falsely imply that, say, a television show is engaged in representing the minority group in a positive way. In the case of Sinners, both Irish culture and black culture was assimilated into the deep southern white culture. Assimilation by religion comes into play in Sinners too, because the early church forced the black population to reconstruct their belief systems to embrace a faith that promotes oppression and submission. At the end of the movie, when Sammy is saying the Lord's Prayer, Rupnik tells him those words had been forced on him too, by the men who stole his father's land. Rupnik then metamorphically baptizes Sammy, shoving his head under the water, saying, "We will make beautiful music together." Rupnik wants to use Sammy's power to reconnect with his ancestors. Othering. Othering in media is a tricky concept to identify, but it involves marginalizing non-white actors and exaggerating the implied superiority of white actors. If you ever watched older black and white movies, you may notice that actors of color play many different ethnicities and white is considered a non-race. Difference. India ideology is difference in an ideology that depicts others as a source of positive experience for white media consumers in that the white consumer will be gain greater pleasure by engaging in the other's culture. Exotism. Another ideology that promotes white privilege is that it romanticizes foreign lands and assumes primitive cultures, oftentimes painting other groups as inferior to white civilized society. Ryan Coogler turned exorcism on its head by having Sammy's music summon their ancestors in a transcendent scene that is both haunting and beautiful. Coogler painted those cultures as equal and likely superior to any white culture by virtue of the power of music.
Culture and ideology are key components of cultural studies, and understanding them is the foundation of our cultural analysis on Ryan Coogler's Sinners. Earlier in our presentation, we quoted sociologist Michael Richardson, who brilliantly observed in our textbook, "Culture is simply what human beings produce and the means by which we preserve what we've produced." Ideology limits our ideas, illuminating some and hiding others, and it normalizes behavior we find to be unquestionable. We've learned about the ideological processes of myth, doxa, and hegemony, and how ideology and media recognition of class is defined by studying the American dream and the concepts of token and conspicuous consumption. As we explored media, ideology, and representation of race and ethnicity, we learned about the ideological concepts of exclusion, whitewashing, stereotyping, assimilation, and othering as it applied to our cultural analysis. Analyzing Sinners, one of the best vampire movies ever made, has been a fascinating experience, and we hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Studying movies through the lens of culture and ideology is a great way to further understand the filmmaker's vision and the impact these media texts have on our society. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation.